Here we go. Okay, we're at Mark 1, verse 29. Last week we had the exorcism in the synagogue, and that ended with Jesus's news about Jesus going everywhere. And then we read this in verse 29. After Jesus left the synagogue with James and John, they went to Simon and Andrew's home. Now Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a high fever. They told Jesus about her right away. So he went to her bedside, took her by the hand, and helped her sit up. Then the fever left her, and she prepared a meal for them. That evening after sunset, many sick and demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus. The whole town gathered at the door to watch. So Jesus healed many people who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons. But because the demons knew who he was, he did not allow them to speak. Okay, now what we just ended was like this amazing public moment. And it was just filled with the authority of Jesus. It was a moment that was it not only amazed the people that were present, but it led to this outpouring of a vast public knowledge about this new voice from God. Jesus was this new voice from God. He had authority and all this. It was just completely unexpected, and everybody was excited. And then what Mark does is he goes straight from that huge public moment to what I would say is the other side of the coin. It's a moment that is completely different than what we just saw with the synagogue demon exorcism. And what we get is a non-public event, something that was as non-public as was possible in the ancient world. And it is anything but loud and exciting. Anything but that. This is Mark has a purpose in setting these two events side by side. I am of the opinion that in this case, because of the way that the text reads, that this is the way Peter told the story. We did this, and then we went home, and this happened, and this is a timeline that we can count on. But it also works really well for Mark's purposes here. It's something really different, and yet it is the same. And it's showing Jesus that he is not, and this is important, he is not like all the other first century healers, and there were tons of them. People who, remember, there's no medical system really. Doctors, have I talked about doctors at all? But that doctors Jews did not have anything to do with doctors. All the medical issues were considered either to be an illness. There are some illnesses, and this fever that we're going to talk about is one of them. There are some illnesses that just happen to you, but for the most part, there is nothing that happens to you physically that is not either some sin that you committed or connected to a demon inside of you somehow causing this. Doctors came out of the pagan world, and while they did know things like how to pull bad teeth and set bones and sew up cuts, for the most part, what they knew about was all of the proper incantations that you had to give to the gods to get people healed. Most doctors were slaves, and they were, because a third of the people in the first century were slaves, and they were smart people who were owned by somebody else who sent them generally to Alexandria, where they studied the medical arts. And so, nobody wanted to have anything to do with doctors if they were Jewish. If you were sick, you went to the priest, and he determined what was going on, and he got you healed. He told you what you needed to do to get healed. So what's under the surface of the Jewish world are a whole bunch of people who say they have a connection to God and can get you healed. And the way they made their living was they went around looking for people who might need a healer. They traveled place to place looking for opportunities to make a living within the Jewish. Is this making sense? What Mark is trying to say is that Jesus isn't like this at all. Jesus never goes out into the world and knocks on doors and said, hey, is anybody sick in here? What he does is he shows up, and a lot of times he can't even show up because the crowds are so big, and he just responds to the need in the moment. The first thing we see is he's preaching in a synagogue, and something breaks out, and he responds to help that guy. Now we're going to see another event where he comes home for dinner and somebody's sick. And so he responds. And this is important because Jesus is not like other people who have the magic words. Okay? This is important. In their first readers, this would have been really important. So, he's, as I said, he's trying to differentiate himself. Now, let me see what I've got here. Now, Mark will give us a lot of verses about miraculous healing, and I have to say that it's been calculated by scholars that there are 200 verses in Mark about Jesus doing something miraculous. That's a lot of verses. But he continually emphasizes that Jesus is a teacher, that he's constantly showing his main role to be a teacher. Even he's supposed to be teaching us about the good news of God. It's what he says he's doing everywhere. And yet Mark gives us almost no what? Teaching. This is important because the miracles of Jesus are the anchor underneath which when the miracles are the means by which there is authority to his words. We don't get a whole lot of words, but we get plenty of power underneath it to say, when he does talk, you better listen. When he does speak, you better listen. And that's what's happening here. Anyway, all that to say, it starts out, this passage in the Greek, it starts out, in the NLT, it goes after Jesus left the synagogue. This is another, and immediately. And immediately. So like they go, Mark is pushing us, and he's pressing the action. And they leave the synagogue, and by the way, it's in the plural. After it says after, it's and immediately they leaving the synagogue. So now we've got what? 4 people that we know of. We've got, 5. Jesus, we've got Peter and Andrew and James and John, and they're the 4 disciples that we know. They're the only ones named up to this point. And I think this is sort of an aside, and this is a Tim thing, and I think I might have told you I want to write this book, but it sounds to me like Peter told this directly to Mark, and he always lists James and John in that order, because I think John and Peter had a problem with each other, and so I think it's just interesting that it's always listed in that order. James and John. Who's the one he's most wanting to say was first? James and John. Anyway, they go there, and it says they went to Simon and Andrew's home. And it says, now Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed. And the first thing I want to tell you is that most newly married couples immediately they went right straight home and lived with the husband's family. Do you know that wives, now there's an interesting aspect of this story, because wives, they were usually about the age of 11 or 12, by the way, and they, newly married, would leave their families and go be now a member of their husband's family. It was a huge deal. These girls were taken. And the reason they married, I shouldn't talk about a lot of this. This is sort of distant to the subject matter. But girls were considered a liability to a family. that it was really important for a father to find the fathers to make deals with other fathers to find a husband for their daughters. And and I could find it if I needed to find it, but there's a word for a girl who turns 13, not married, or at least not engaged to soon be married, and it's the same phrase as we call an old maid. But anyway, they wanted to get them married and then go off to live in the husband's home, family home, and if anything should happen, like she burns the dinner or they find her not to be as pretty as they thought before she took her veil off or something, her family's only obligated to take her back for 1 month before she's on her own. She does have her dowry, which she was given at her marriage, which is for her to use in case she's thrown out and has nowhere to go. So she'll have a little bit of something to live off for a while. But the interesting thing in this is that who is living in Peter and Andrew's home? His mother-in-law. Now this is really odd that she would be living in that house. Now, the average age of a man's death in the first century in Palestine was 50. Women tended to live much longer. And so it's not unusual to have a widowed mother. What this shows is, now, a lot of people, what this shows is that Peter loved his mother-in-law because there was only a month's obligation for dad to take his daughter back. There was no obligation for son-in-law to take his mother-in-law in. Does this make sense? So what we've got is a really interesting moment. Now, a lot of scholars will say this. They'll say, Peter's wife has died. He is a widower. And that he's taking his mother-in-law in because her husband's gone, and he's taking her in to be kind to the wife that he loved so much but died early on. Now, that's purely speculative. We do know that later on, I think in 1 Corinthians, somewhere, we find out that Peter, when he was traveling, he took his wife with him. And they say that he did. Yeah, there's Paul saying, don't we have the right? I was right, 1 Corinthians. Don't we have the right to bring a believing wife with us as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do, as Peter does? So he's taken his wife with him, and then people say, well, his first wife died, and then he spent all that time with Jesus because he was single, and he would have never left his wife at home. And then he got remarried. And this woman but we don't know any of that. For all we know, believe me, guys leaving their wives at home back then, that was not an issue. They loved their wives, but they're property. Okay, let's just put it into the terrible context that it was. So it says, now Simon's mother-in-law, so she's in the house, was sick in bed with a high fever. High is not in the Greek. It is this story is in the other Gospels, and it is in those other stories. This one, it just says with a fever. Now, it's important for us to know that a fever was not symptomatic of a sinful something that makes you sick. Almost everything else is connected to, and I could get the list. I have it somewhere in my files of all the sicknesses and their connection to sins. And leprosy, I think I mentioned, was slander. And so they're all connected to something, and that's how they judged you. When you got sick with anything, they figured, oh, you were up to this. And so she has a high fever. She's really sick. This illness is purely an illness in Jewish thinking. Now, what Jesus is about to do is in no way connected to the way that you would heal someone who needed forgiveness. All right? Now, this is important. So he goes in, and she's sick, and we know she's really sick because she stays in bed. She stays in bed. A woman's role, particularly, now think about her. She is the mother-in-law of a girl who married into Peter's family, and she's living in their house. Oh, by the way, most of the time, the way, like if Peter and his wife had their own house, they really wouldn't have their own house. They would have like there would be a central court with a bunch of separate units around it that were all the same family. And the way that you got your own family place was that you got enough money to have the builders come and build it. Otherwise, you slept on the roof over mom and dad. And see, they're up on the roof here. And this is absolutely, animals and everything is all like this. And so, but for a mother-in-law to be living in her son-in-law's household is very unusual. And so what she is going to be doing in that household to show her appreciation is to live out to the best of her ability every one of the expectations of a woman in a household. And I got to tell you, one of the main expectations of a woman in any household in first century Galilee was that she waited on men when they showed up as guests. And they didn't know anything about germs. And they didn't, germs, it would be 19 centuries before mankind knew things like germs existed. And they had no notion that if I'm sick, I could give it to you. Because they're thinking, if I'm sick with something and you get it, then we both did the same bad thing. They're not thinking that I gave it to you. They're thinking different things about the world. And so for her to not get out of bed, even though she had a fever, and wait on these guys because they'd come home for dinner is almost unimaginable, because she is wanting to live up to the expectations that this other family has on her because they're being so kind to let her live there. It's just making sense. I just want to make sure we got the picture here. She is really sick because she doesn't get up at all. Now it says they told Jesus about her right away. Now, I have no idea who the they is. Who's the they? Maybe it's all the women in the house. Or maybe it was Andrew and Peter, or Simon. He's still Simon. He's not called Peter yet. Maybe it's them. I don't know. But there could be two reasons that they wanted to tell Jesus why she was sick right away. Now, the first one could be purely politeness. Because Jesus, now some scholars think that Jesus was living in this household, that this is where he lived. We don't know that. But if he was living there, he must have just moved in, because if he was living there, he'd have known she was sick. They wouldn't have had to tell him, because everybody, they all lived within like 12 feet of each other. So he would have known. But the point is this, that they may have wanted to make sure that Jesus and then the two rich boys, John and James, who are there, they know why the older woman in the house is not coming and doing her duty. Because to not do it would be an affront to them. For a woman in the house to choose to stay in her bedroom or back in the back while they're there waiting to have dinner, this is just unimaginable. Hey, I gotta say that one of my grandparents, one of my grandmothers, told me that when she first met her soon-to-be husband and went to the family house for dinner, the men all ate first, and then the women came in and were to eat off the dirty plates that the men had just eaten off of, and she said she would not eat off of a dirty plate, and they all decided in that family that she was just too uppity. Now, if this happened at the beginning of the 20th century, can you imagine in the first century what the difference would have been? So one of the reasons could be that they just wanted to make sure that somebody knew, that Jesus and John and James knew that she's so sick she can't get out of bed. That's why she's not waiting. And that could be one reason. But the other reason could be that they wanted Jesus to do something about it. Now, up to this point in the book, we've not had any healings. Not saying specifically the healing. I mean, he did some things. It says he did some things, but the big thing is that he exorcised a demon. But my feeling is that they probably had already seen Jesus heal in some manner. But I don't know whether they told Jesus about her right away. It's immediately thing. Now, I know that's pushing the story on, but it's like it's really fast. They finish at the synagogue, and they walk straight over to their house, and they go in, and they go, oh, she's sick, and they tell him, and it's moving really fast. I don't know what, but Jesus himself responds in the same way that he did when the man yelled out at him. He responded immediately to the problem at hand. It says they told Jesus about her right away, and it says, so he went to her bedside and took her by the hand. I want to actually read let's see. Man. I'm looking for the Greek, just one second. Jesus goes straight into action. This sentence actually reads like this. Is it up above me already? It says, and approaching, these are participles, and approaching, raising her, holding her hand, the fever left her. Now this is really cool. It's like one word, one word, one word. This is simple stuff that says, that word, it's hegeren, that's up there in the dark bold. Hegeren. He raised. It's a word that's generally used for raising somebody from the dead. Powerful word. It's going to come back around. We're going to have more of this later. But it's like, now my thinking is this. He comes into where she is. He comes right up to her. And and she sees that he's there. And so she tries to move. But then he just takes her by the hand and lifts her up. Now, touching was a huge part of healing ministries broadly, but you watch as we go through this story in Mark, how often Jesus physically touches people. His touch is really an important part of his healing, and much of the time, his touch is completely against any of the sensibilities that the Jews would have had about whether you touch that person or not. Or people try to touch him. And have I told you that they believe that anybody who had the power to heal, that it not only did their body have the power in it if you touched them, but their clothes and their body fluids, like their spit and stuff like that. And all of that stuff carried the power. But he goes to her. And the most important thing to remember is, do you remember when I said like healers had the what? The incantations. Jesus doesn't even speak. Jesus just takes her by the hand. I think she saw him coming, starts to get up, and as he reaches out and touches her, then the fever leaves. And he helps her up. And he didn't have to say anything. No prayer, no nothing. Why? Because Jesus is that powerful. Now, this is like the man with the demon. In their world, the man with the demon, we don't need to talk about how he got the demon. Something from the outside has come into him and taken over and made his life miserable. The woman, something from the outside has come into her, taken over, and made her life miserable. And Jesus, in the one case, commands it out. And in the second place, he doesn't even have to speak, because he is that powerful over that which can come into us and make our lives miserable. This is the power of his ability to heal us completely. And I think that, it's like, I love it. It's the right away thing is, it was what? Immediate. And she sits up, and the next, it's the fever left her, and she prepared a meal for them. This thing about preparing a meal for them is just like, back when I was in school in England, I studied under a guy named Billy Strachan. Billy Strachan was a Scottish man who literally cut my knees out from under me in his teaching. I have never known anybody who got the Word of God more powerfully than Billy Strachan. He was so earth connected in all of the things that he taught. He used to drag me around to cities in England and make me watch him do these talks and stuff, and it was always different and cool and amazing. And you know what his favorite verse in the Bible was? This one. And he said, Tim, this verse, because she was what? Healed to serve. Healed to serve. He said, remember that. He constantly said this to me. Never forget that whatever healing Jesus has given to you through what he did for you on the cross, it is not to get you into heaven. It is to get you busy. And this is like, okay, I get it. I get it, Billy. I get it. The word here for serve is diakonos. Is it up there? Yeah. And she served them. Oh, there it is in English, yeah. And she served them. A couple of things about this. First is that she was now returned to what? She got up out of bed and did exactly what was expected of her. What it did was it took away any shame that she might have that she's living in a house under the goodness of her daughter's husband's whatever, just his goodness to her. So she's in a bad place to begin with. She's a real problem if she's just sick and can't do anything. But now she's up and doing what? Exactly what gives her a reason to live. We don't hear anything about the guy who had the demon in the synagogue. But let me tell you, my bet is that homecoming was amazing. And I don't know what he did for a living, but every Jew, including the priests and everybody, had to have a job. And if he was demon-possessed like that showed it, he probably wasn't able to do much. But when he came home, I'm sure everybody was really glad to see him. Why? Because in their world, if you did not do the role that you were created to do within your community as they thought about it, then you didn't really have any value. In fact, they thought of people who did not have any value within the community. They were either declared such because they were paralytics or something like that, or else they didn't even consider you a human being. And so this man gets it, and now we get it right back here. She gets to do what? Serve them. This is not a condescension on her position. This is lifting her up to the place where she is supposed to be. This is a beautiful moment. It's a beautiful moment. The word that is the diakonos word is the word that gives us clearly deacon. The word in the Greek simply means to be a waiter. Because, the original deacons were waiters at the tables for the Greek-speaking widows of the early church. When Stephen was made a deacon, and those other guys that were named deacons, they got the great honor of doing women's work for women. Now, we're not here to talk about Acts, but we don't very often talk about the humiliation in the broader culture it would be to be given the job of serving women at tables. It's also the same word that is used when the angels came to Jesus when he was in the wilderness earlier, and it said the angels took care of him. You remember that? Same word. They waited on him. I've been thinking about waiters and looking up the word a lot lately. Waiters, we forget what the first half of that word is. It's wait. And you do what? You either do what you obviously see is needed at the moment or what you perceive is needed at the moment, but otherwise you just stand and what? Look. And get busy when you see something has to be done. A waiter is different than we think, because we make waiters are second-class citizens in our world because they're supposed to come out and take care of us big time. But in their world, it was somebody who stood off to the side and responded when they figured that something needed to be done. That's a pretty cool difference. It's a pretty cool difference. John Milton has a really amazing, you know John Milton? He has this amazing poem. John Milton was the spokesman for the King of England during the time that the English church broke away from the Catholic Church. And he was the guy who wrote all the rebuttals to the Catholics. And he was the guy that wrote all the theological papers. And he was the big shot in the whole country. And then suddenly he went blind. And he couldn't write anymore. He couldn't see to write or read or anything. And has a great sonnet that he talks about how, when I consider how my light is spent, his seeing. And it just goes on. And then at the end, he remembers these moments, and how there are people who also, he ends it by saying something to the effect, they also serve who only stand and wait. And that's a really strong, powerful thing for me, because sometimes I can think, where is my life going? What am I doing? What's important? I don't feel like I'm going anywhere, and we get it right here. Some of the greatest people in the whole of the Bible, their title was waiter. And what are they doing? They're just watching and waiting and ready to act because they've been healed by Jesus. And he's got something for them to do, and he'll let them know, and they'll feel it in their spirit, and they'll get up and go. That's cool to me. I think that kind of preaches. It kind of preaches. Anyway, it had a huge impact on me. I'll never forget Billy Strachan. He passed away. Get this. Our son, my wife is here, so I'll speak in the plural. Our son decided many years after I'd graduated from Cape and Ray to go to Cape and Ray. And he went, and guess who was still the principal of Cape and Ray College? It was Billy Strachan. And Billy Strachan got to cut his knees out from under him. And Billy Strachan got to do the same things with my son that he'd done with me 20-some years earlier. And shortly after my son graduated from there, Billy Strachan went to be with Jesus. And I know this sounds almost too self-absorbed, but I have this deep feeling that Billy hung on so that my son could know what made his dad the kind of man that he is. Because I would say that 90% of my vision of how it is to walk with Jesus came from one man, and it's him. And his verse was, healed to serve. Anyway, we got to go on. And let's see. We're on to the next section. In verse, let's see, what time is it? Oh, let's see. Yeah, let's just go on. We'll go on for a little bit. It says, verse 35. Oh, no. 32. Yeah, I was trying to get us further along. You know, I did some math on how long it's going to take to do this book. I don't know which session this is, but we're not. I brought notes to finish the chapter. It's not going to happen. But I was trying to figure out how long you'd have to put up with me to get to the end. And what is it? What is it I always used to say? We'll be in the second Chelsea Clinton administration. Is that what I used to say? That'll get you going. Anyway. That evening after sunset, many sick and demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus. The whole town gathered at the door to watch. So Jesus healed many people who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons. But because the demons knew who he was, he did not allow them to speak. Okay, wait a minute. I got to find out where I am in the notes. Let's see. Good. Okay, now, there's an important thing right at the beginning. It says that evening after sunset. You guys know why that's important? Because everything that's happened up to here in this is on the Sabbath. And they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Jesus is breaking all kinds of rules by healing people on the Sabbath. Just let me tell you, if you were a healer or a doctor, though they didn't really like doctors, it was against the Sabbath rules to get anybody well before the Sabbath day was over. If they could live till the Sabbath was over, you better not do anything about it. This is why later on Jesus is going to say, "Wait, what do you mean I'm not supposed to do good things on the Sabbath?" It's because the rules said you don't do that. The rules also said that you don't walk any further than, remember some time ago I talked about the distance you could walk, and it's only about like 400 paces or something like that, the distance from the shore to the middle of the River Jordan. Or the other thing was, you couldn't carry a heavy weight. The weird thing about a heavy weight was nobody ever came to a decision about what a heavy weight was. And so wherever you went, the people locally had their own idea about it. And like if you're carrying a bag of flour in one town and it was not too heavy, they might really get you if you went next to the next town over, because they all thought that was just too much. But the point is that this says what? That evening after sunset. What's happened? Because the day is gone from what? It goes from sunset to sunset. And so he's had the Sabbath stuff, and the sun sets, and then everybody can come out and run over to this house. And it says that many sick and demon-possessed people were what? Brought to Jesus, which implies they were carried there. That's what the whole of the Greek implies, that they were brought there by other people. They're like, "We're going to get you well, Grandma," and they put her on a bed and start hauling her off, that kind of thing. And so, but they weren't about to do that until when? Sunset, because they're still worried about the law. Now we already know what about Jesus. He's not worried about law like that. He's already thrown one demon out and healed Peter's mother-in-law. Both of those things would have, because that demon wasn't going to kill that guy. Well, you could wait till tonight, Jesus said, let's just wait, okay? And I don't know whether it says he took her by the hand and lifted her, but I don't even know if that exercise of doing that might have been lifting too much weight. Somebody, you laugh at that, but you never know back in that world at the time. So anyway, so they're bringing sick and demon-possessed people. Now here it's interesting because it doesn't say people with unclean spirits, because if you know that first guy was just an unclean spirit, it just says demons here. They're just demon-possessed. And it says, now they brought him to Jesus. It says the whole town gathered at the door to watch. Now Mark has a tendency to be hyperbolic. He has a tendency to say the whole town or everybody or all of he does. But I'm not going to blame Mark for that, because I'm going to blame Peter for that, because that's what. Now, there were about 1,500 people in this town at the time. Now, I'm just saying there probably wasn't that much to do on a Saturday evening in Capernaum. The fact that there was a guy who could cast out demons, that's a good show. It's like they didn't have anything much else to do. And so, it's possible that everybody came, the whole town. But I don't know. But we get the idea of what? It was a big crowd. It's a big crowd. And they all gathered at the door to see what Jesus would do. Why? Because they'd never seen anybody like this before. And it says that Jesus healed many people who were sick with various diseases. That's essentially what it says. And he cast out many demons. He is bringing healing to these people. Now, again, they associated sickness with either sin or with demon possession. And so whatever it is that Jesus is doing, he's giving people back their lives. You know how they knew that somebody had been forgiven for their sin was if they got well. And so a man who can come and heal them, he's working through the power of God that says, what? You're well because you've been forgiven. Not you're well because I just have power to make you well. So he's giving them back all kinds of stuff. And he's freeing people from the demon possession, which I don't know what that's like. I honestly have never been possessed by a demon, but there's no picture of it that's ever in the Bible where it's anything but awful. Hell would be a good word to describe it. Fully separated from the presence of God, which is what that really means when you get down to it. Also, some scholars, and I'll just throw this out, some scholars get really worked up about the fact if the whole town came and Jesus healed many, and many demons were cast out, that means there were some people that he chose not to do it for. Like he did because he didn't do it for everybody. Can I just tell you, that is one of the goofiest theological arguments I have ever read. And I can give you the books. And they're like, what? Okay, guys, they must have been told by your editor you needed 375 pages, because to go on and on about this is silly. It's just parsing the Greek too much. My thinking is this. Peter tells him, can you hear Peter saying this? He's preaching. He goes, we were at my house, and nobody knew it, but Jesus had just he just healed my mother-in-law. She was sick, but nobody knew about that. But the stuff that he'd done at the synagogue was so amazing just a couple hours earlier that as soon as the sun went down, everybody in town came to my house and stood right at the door. And Jesus healed a whole bunch of people who were sick, and he healed many people who had demons. I can hear Peter talking like that. That's the way he probably talked about it. And you know what Mark did? He just repeated what he'd translated for Peter many times, because he wants us to know that Jesus did what? And here's another thing. Jesus did not go out and knock on doors when the sun went down and said, anybody sick in here? A denarius will get you a long way. He didn't. What happened? He was present, and the people came to him, and he responded. This is what our lives are supposed to be like. I know that we're supposed to go out in the world and spread the gospel, but when we live moment to moment, all of the time, all around us who are people who need to be what? Healed. Healed. By whom? Jesus. And what do? We respond with the message of Jesus when we come in contact. And this is what he did. He brings the kingdom in. And what he's doing is he's showing everybody what the values of the king of the kingdom are. And that is that we're going to take care of this problem for you right now, because you have a life to live that is far more important than the one you're missing because of what's happening to you right now. So let's fix this. Says, and then, God, I'm preaching tonight. Sorry. I'm just feeling it. Anyway. And we'll take a break in a minute. It says, because the demons knew who he was. Now, can I tell you that the Bible does not give us the history of the fall of the angels who became demons. It really doesn't. One verse, Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning out of the heavens, something like that. And almost everything that we've built on it comes from that. There is very little in the scripture that gives us the narrative that we now feel is true. I think it's true that the demons are fallen angels who, and most of this we get from, I have mentioned his name already once before, John Milton. Milton in Paradise Lost lays it out. I think he's right, that the third of heaven rebelled and went with Lucifer because they refused to believe that they needed to be, and the same thing they tried to get us to believe, that they felt they had a right to be equal to God, and so they were punished for their sin of trying to make themselves equal with God. Okay, does this make sense? And they didn't get grace because they were created in the presence of God, and they saw him face to face, and we don't know how long they lived in the presence of God. And so there's no grace for somebody who knows all the truth about it and then falls out of it. And so but the way that they would have known who he was that they were at one time in his presence. Now, we don't really get that. That's never spelled out, but I think it's right. The reason that they know who he is because they, as spiritual beings, have spent some kind of eternal time, whatever that looks like, in the presence of Jesus in his full majesty, pre-becoming a man, and they know exactly who they're dealing with because they, by being spiritual beings, have some understanding of the Spirit that's empowering him. Now, this is all part of the story. This constantly says they knew who he was, and he said, be quiet. He says, be quiet. Now, there are a number of reasons that scholars have come up with why Jesus doesn't want them to speak. One is, can I just look at my notes? I have them spelled out. So just let me just. Okay, these are in ridiculous to probably right order. Jesus told them that I didn't make these up, okay? So like if I say something that just like you go, oh, come on. I got this from a book that somebody paid somebody to write, okay? So it was, all right. It was that Jesus didn't know what was up, and so he didn't want any rumors started. Like he wasn't sure what was actually going on, so he didn't want these demons to tell people what was up because he was trying to figure it out himself. You know, it's like, that's goofy. Okay, second, that Jesus was trying to fulfill what he believed was his calling, and he didn't want others to announce him in any other way. So like he knew what he was about, but he was just trying to work it out, and so he didn't want these demons to say anything about him. Okay, that's one. Then another one is that Jesus was waiting for a big announcement to come from the heavens to let everybody know who he was. And he didn't want these demons telling anybody. Okay, that's one. And the last one is the reason that he didn't want them announcing who he was because their purpose in announcing who he is or speaking about who he is always to try to turn everyone against him. Their announcement of him would be counterproductive because their intentions are always to defame him in some manner through their announcement of him. Remember, the demonic world is always lying to us, even when they tell us the truth. They're always working something to get us off of the right path, even when they tell us. They come as a what? A light. Because they're trying to lead us to darkness. What I think is that I'm sure that Jesus knew who they were. He'd had interaction with them, and he just said, you are to be quiet. Because I am going to live out a way that announces who I am. I get to tell people who I am. God has already said it, who I am. And so I think that's what's up here. There is a thing called the Messianic Secret. It's a Markian theological point. The story runs constantly. Jesus is constantly telling people not to tell anybody who he is. And some people go, well, it didn't even really happen like that. Mark just added it to the story to add a little mystery to everything. I think that's goofy. And then there's other people will say, well, it's the primary narrative and we should only study the book by looking at the people who were told not to talk about Jesus. What I think is that that's all fine, I guess, the thing about the narrative thing. But I don't think that Jesus telling people not to talk about him, because he does it a lot. I don't think this is a narrative. It's not part of the narrative that we need to focus on, other than the fact that we need to just look at who he's talking to and why, because he's got a bigger thing, and that he wants us to judge him by two things: what he says and what he does, not by what anybody else has to say about him. What he says and what he does. And he certainly doesn't want to be introduced by demons who have it out for him. They know he's in human form. They know if they can get him, it's going to be now. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to get him. They know this. And so they're working like crazy. And so he just says, shut up. Shut up. And they have to do it. His ability to stop the demons from doing anything is the same as his ability to heal a fever. That's what he's saying to us right now. But the best part is he's on our side. Okay? He's on our side. This moment is the moment, what we just read, where Jesus has healed this woman, this mother-in-law, and then all these people coming to him is a moment of ultimate authority. And Jesus demands that the demons stop tormenting people and he's not even concerned about how they got there in the first place. And he demands that they be silent because all they want to do is to shout out anything that might bring chaos to Jesus' mission. This is important for us to remember that their purpose in life is to bring chaos to that which God wants to bring heavenly order to. And I wrote, we can assume that it was, we don't get any details about any of this. We can assume it was much like the earlier episode. But what Mark does tell us is that Jesus responded to the crowd with action, and that all of his action brought healing and reconciliation to those in need. And that is the call on our lives, to bring healing and reconciliation to all who are in need. One interesting thing about this, you would think by what just happened in Capernaum that it would be a place of great following of Jesus. It's just the opposite. This is we will see as we go through the gospel, this is a great example of people will follow something or do something as long as they get what they want. But there will come a time when Jesus preaches in Capernaum and he makes a demand on them. He will make a demand that they need to listen to his teaching and do what he says. And their amazement will turn to dismissal almost immediately. Capernaum is not the place where the revival starts in the hearts of the people from Capernaum. It's just the place where Jesus starts his ministry. Okay? Okay, on we go. And we don't have a whole lot of time. Let's see what happens, okay? Before daybreak, the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Later, Simon and the others went out to find him. And when they found him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." But Jesus replied, "We must go on to other towns as well, and I will preach to them too. That is why I came." So he traveled through the region of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and casting out demons. Now, this passage, from all that we can tell, falls on the heels of a really busy Sabbath day, though what has just been described, and the text literally reads, "and very early in the night" is what it actually reads. And it's because the way they divided things up, they divided the nighttime up into 4-hour hunks, and the last 4-hour hunk ended when the sun rose, and so it means that very early in the night would mean that he got up about 4 hours before the sun was going to rise. Now, he goes out and to an isolated place. He goes out into the wilderness is essentially what it says. The word means the same thing as the place where he was earlier when the devil tempted him, and it's the same word for the place where John the Baptist was preaching. He's out in an isolated wilderness place to pray. Just want to say a couple of things. Jews did not have a habit of getting up in the morning or the night at anything like this to pray. This was not normal. They prayed mostly in the synagogues or on the street corners standing up with their arms like this. They didn't have morning devotions like we do, we talk about. Jesus clearly had something in his heart and mind, and he couldn't sleep. And so he got up and he went out to a place where he could be alone. Being alone was not something that they did either. You'll find that most of the time, anytime anybody's alone in the first century, they're with a group of people. It's just a smaller group of people, but they're always with somebody. This is very unusual that Jesus goes out alone. He sneaks out to talk to God about what's coming. Jesus only prays 3 times in the book of Mark. He prays here before he begins this ministry out into Galilee. And this is an important moment for Jesus. He prays right before he walks on the water through the storm. And then he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. Those are the only times he prays. And if you think about those events, those are all major moments in his life. because things are happening. He's going into the storm of Galilee, if you will, to which we'll see what happens when he goes out into Galilee. He's going into that thing, and then he goes into a literal physical storm, and then he goes into the chaos of the cross. These are all big moments. We'll talk about the others when we get to it. But Jesus is not, like in the other Gospels, he is shown praying far more often. But it says later, Simon and others went out to find him. Now, do you have that Greek there by any chance, Jeff? The word there, when it says they went out to find him, is actually a word to search for someone with great anxiety. There we go. Is this guy good or what? Hunted down is the better translation. And hunted down Jesus, Simon, and the ones with him. It is interesting to me that in the Greek, all through this bit of the passage, it only mentions Peter or Simon. I think this was because that's the way Mark remembered the way that the story was told to him by Peter. But it's like they are out looking for him because what we don't know is if they knew where to go to find him, or if they had to search and search and search. But the hunted down is a really strong word. And so they're clearly working hard to find Jesus. I don't know if they were nervous about it, that he might have disappeared or what. But the other thing is this, that we hear from when Peter speaks to Jesus about this. Clearly, there'd already been a whole bunch of people show up at the house. Because it's, can you put the text back up for me again? It's, Jeff, thank you. It says, later Simon and the others went out to find him, and when they found him, they said, everyone is looking for you. And there's a lot in that. It's like, first off, we don't know what everyone means, but there's another hyperbolic statement. But you know what? I can see why. Now, some people say, well, the reason they're looking for you, they were looking for him was because he didn't heal everybody the first night. And I think that's crazy. It's just that if you have somebody like that in town and he's done this much good, then everybody's talking about it and the people are coming. And they've come in the morning and they're looking for him, and they're really saying, where have you been? There's like, why are you out here? Why are you out here? And I can understand their frustration. I can't imagine what it would be like to wake up and have the whole town at your door, wanting to get something from somebody that's suddenly, they're going, he's not here. And it would be very unusual for somebody to get up before everybody else and go out and pray like this. And so can you put the next verse up for me, Jeff? We're going to, Jesus is like he doesn't even pay any attention to what they said. It's like he's not really concerned about the fact that people were looking for him, because he's got something on his mind. And he says, we must go on to other towns as well. He's got a mission. He needs to go into Galilee and preach the kingdom of God. He says, this is why, and he says it straight up. The word that's used there, it's charismazo, I think that's how you say it, preach. It means to declare. Yeah, there it is. That there I should be proclaiming. That's a good translation. It says, I need to go out and proclaim. Now, have you ever heard the word kerygma? Any of you ever heard of the word kerygma? Good. Kerygma is the theological word at a seminary that talks about preaching. That's who I have my kerygma class this afternoon at 3. I said, stop. It's preaching class. Anyway. Or I run into a seminarian and they'll go, how's the kerygma going at your church now? I go, shut up. It's just like if I were to refer to each of these stories as a pericope. Please. Anyway, the point is that this term, this word that gives us, that he says he'll go preach to them, it becomes almost a technical term in the book of Acts. Every time anybody proclaims the resurrection of Jesus, this word is the word that is used for their proclamation. Thus, that's why we have the theological term of preaching the word of God is kerygma. And It's okay. It's okay. But what Jesus is saying is, I have something. Now, they're not thinking preaching. They're thinking proclamation of the good news. That's way cooler than preaching. I got something important to tell you about the defeat of the enemy, which is what the good news is all about. I have something important to tell you about our victory over the one who wants to do what to us? Destroy us. And I'm not only going to tell you about it, but I am going to do what? I'm going to show you what it looks like. And so he's traveled throughout the region of Galilee. Now, do you remember when I read to you earlier in the class, for those of you who were here, about the prophecy that talked about Jesus? It says in Galilee there will be a what? A great light in Galilee. Here it comes. Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy that Galilee will be lit up by the good news of the kingdom. It says he preached in synagogues, he proclaimed the good news in synagogues. And he cast out demons. Now, once again, the preaching is about, we're not getting any of it. We're not getting any of it. But the proclamation is the good news that there has been victory over our enemies, and it is here now. You know what Jesus is doing? He's doing the same thing that we do when we obey God. He was giving them a picture of the hope of the future in the present. This is what we are all about as followers of Jesus. When we walk into people's lives, when we live with them in the manner that God calls us to live with them, when we serve him in the manner that he calls us, we give people a vision of the hope of the future, if you catch of what God will eventually do, in the present. Now that's N.T. Wright's, if N.T. Wright were here, he would say that's his watchword. Our lives are to give people a vision, a vision of the hope of the future in the present. And this is exactly what Jesus is doing. The power, it's one thing to say the revolution is here. We're all involved in a revolution. I think that's what Bernie Sanders' thing is, about the revolution. There's not much evidence of his revolution in the world, really. Jesus says that victory has been won. Boom. And here's proof. Get out and don't speak a word. Get up and walk. Boom, 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 boom. I think that's cool. Now here's the last, I'll just stop here because the next section is really long and really cool, by the way. What isn't really cool? I suppose numbers isn't that cool, but let me see if I got it right here. What is happening now? Let me just read it. This is, Jesus preached and he cast out demons. This is enough for us to know that Jesus was on the move, that he was on a mission, and that what he'd been doing in Capernaum has now been done throughout all of Galilee. Galilee was seeing the great light. The prophet's words were being fulfilled. Earlier, we saw the details of an exorcism followed by a brief description of a healing, followed by a detailed description of a healing, followed by a brief description of an exorcism. You see that? Boom, 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 boom. And it's done that way from a literary point to re-emphasize what Jesus is about. We get a detail of each kind and a non-detail of each kind. And any time you have two things of the same next to each other in the scripture, take note. That's what we have, because this is why Jesus came. This is why he came. He didn't come and remember, he didn't come just to heal. He came to let everybody know that a kingdom has come where healing is just a part of the fabric of what that kingdom is. The heart of the king of that kingdom is to make your life one that is completely disconnected from the powers that would hope to bring you to your knees. Does this make sense? I think it's cool. Now I know that, guys, we live in a world that's broken. We all suffer the illnesses and the difficulties. But the hope of our future is that someday it will all be what? Healed. When the king comes in his fullest and we live in the fullness of his kingdom. We live in a now, present, and not quite yet world. And yet we serve a king who, to him, it's just a matter of until we all live in that fulfillment of what he wanted, what he created us to be and to how to live. It's coming. And Jesus is a sign that it can happen just like that. Just like that. I think it's cool. And I think that's good. Let's stop there. Hey, thanks. I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about the next thing. Thanks, yeah.